Hello, fellow story sojourners. My name is Elian J. Kildare, or EJK for short. That is a pen name and not my real name because I'm a writer and I love to discuss all things writing and storytelling. Welcome to Stories That Shaped Me, a podcast about stories across media that have impacted or inspired me in some way, both as a person and as a writer. By talking about stories I love, I hope to open up the conversation about why storytelling is an integral part of the human experience. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Stories That Shaped Me. I'm Elian J. Kildare, or EJ Kildare, which is my pen name, and I'm a writer and recent creative writing graduate from the University of Oxford. Like I stated in the intro, this podcast is focused on examining stories that have had some impact or influence on me, both as a person and as a writer. And I'm going to be talking about stories across different media, so that includes books, movies, TV shows, and possibly even games if it strikes my interest. This podcast is going to be pretty informal, and as of now, I'm going it alone, so please bear with me if there's any hiccups in terms of me rambling or any technical issues. I'm learning as I go, and it's not always a smooth process, but I'm trying my best, so thank you so much for being here. So, with that out of the way, I'm just gonna dive right into our first topic, which is centered around one of the most talked about TV shows of the past year, which is Welcome to Derry. If you don't know what the show is, it is essentially a prequel to the 2017 and 2019 It films directed by Andy Muschietti. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. And it's based on the novel by Stephen King. It premiered on HBO Max at the end of 2025 and it generated quite a lot of buzz. I think it was one of the most popular shows of the past year and one of the most watched shows of the past year. So even if you haven't seen it, you've probably heard about it. And I think most people know it as the story of Pennywise the Clown and the havoc that he wreaks on this small town of Derry, Maine, particularly its younger residents. And the first season of Welcome to Derry takes place in 1962, which is about 27 years before It Chapter 1, and it sets the stage for much of what happens in both that and its sequel, It Chapter 2. So I'm just going to warn you guys now, this episode will contain major spoilers for the first season of Welcome to Derry. So if you're still planning on watching it, but you haven't gotten around to it yet, now's the time to pause and come back once you're finished. But if you have seen the show or you haven't but don't mind spoilers, then stick around because I want to talk about the, in my opinion, standout character of the first season, who is, of course, Rich Santos. Get your tissues out now if you know. If you know, get the tissues out. But anyway, Rich is a member of the 1962 edition of the Losers Club, if you remember from the movies. That's the ragtag group of kids in Derry. They're all outcasts who kind of come together and become friends, who are trying to face off against Pennywise and all of his various attempts to terrorize this town. Rich gets roped into this adventure with his friend, Will Hanlon, who, if you remember, grows up to become the father of Mike Hanlon in the movies, who's a very pivotal character in those films. And they're joined by Lily Bainbridge, whom the entire town has ostracized for her mental health struggles in the wake of her father's death, and Ronnie Grogan, whose father is wanted by the authorities in connection to the deaths of several other kids at the beginning of the show. That happens in the pilot episode. We know it's Pennywise's fault, but unfortunately, Ronnie's father is accused of the murders. And we also have Lily's best friend and Rich's crush, Marge Truman, who we find out is struggling with her self image and her desire to fit in at school. Now, I want to start out by talking about a pretty interesting point about Rich, which is that throughout the course of this season, all of the other losers are targeted by Pennywise in the form of some pretty horrific visions that hit at their deepest fears and insecurities, since we know his whole deal is that he preys off of people's fear. You have a vision with Lily seeing her dead father who died in a pickle factory accident. Ronnie getting a vision of her mother dying in childbirth, which is something that I think she feels pretty guilty about. Stuff like that. But Rich is the only one out of this group who's never subject to this type of targeting from Pennywise. He's just part of this group of friends because he wants community, he wants friends, he wants to hang out with Marge because he likes her. And it's not necessarily that I think he doesn't have any fears or concerns, because there's an allusion to his Cuban background, which you remember this is the 1960s in small town America, potentially being an issue when it comes to prejudice and feeling like a part of the Derry community and fitting in with his peers. You kind of get the sense that he's had trouble making friends, which is why initially he's so desperate to spend time with Will and the girls. There's this particularly hilarious scene where he comes up with this story that he knows how to summon ghosts or talk to the dead or something, which the kids are trying to do, I think, and he brings them to the graveyard and comes up with this whole story of like, oh, my cousin taught me how to do all of this stuff, and then it turns out to be complete nonsense. And he only made it up because he just wanted to hang out with them. But unlike his friends, Rich doesn't seem quite as consumed by those fears and insecurities, although you could make the argument that they're still very present. And I think that this is one of the things that contributes to his whole character arc, which is very heavily rooted in the idea of facing darkness and standing up to evil in spite of being scared or in spite of the fact that the world is, in Rich's case, sadly, quite literally burning around you. But what sticks out to me, especially about Rich's character, is that he's not some big time hero. He gets his big heroic moment at the end of the show, which I'm going to go into in a little bit. But he's not someone who saves the town or saves the world or does anything particularly earth shattering in the grand scheme of things, aside from helping lock Pennywise away for another 27 years in the finale, which I just have to say, side note, is quite possibly one of my favorite scenes in a TV show ever. Flipping Pennywise off at the end was just so iconic, and I love that the Muschiettis put that scene into the show. But anyway, to get back on track, Rich's presence and his actions in the story speak to this idea that true heroism often isn't about the big global saving the world type of things, but it's the little things that you do to help those in your community or to bring good into your corner of the world. So does Rich fix the fear and the prejudice that exists in Derry? Because there's a lot of that going on. This town is plagued by so much prejudice and discrimination and violence. No, Rich doesn't fix all of that. Like, does he defeat Pennywise for good? Temporarily, yes, but permanently, no. But none of that makes his actions irrelevant. He's moral support for his friends. He brings joy to his friends since he's the jokester. He's the one who's smiling and joking around most of the time. He helps Marge overcome her fear of not fitting in and to just make peace with embracing herself. And ultimately, he ends up saving her life when the Black Spot Club, which is this club primarily for the Black community in Derry, is burnt down by this racist mob. Now, none of these actions change the world in a big dramatic way, but they matter to his friends and to his community. There are these little ripples in a large ocean that still mean something, even if they don't solve Derry's problems overnight. And all of this comes out most prominently through Rich's relationship with Marge. Like I mentioned, he's an integral part of Marge's character growth. His friendship and his kindness are what encourage her to stop trying to change herself to fit in with this clique of girls at their school, the Patty Cakes. She grows more confident in herself and lets go of her need to alter parts of herself to fit in with the wrong people, all because of Rich's presence. And Rich's own confidence in himself, and also the fact that he seems to value Marge as she is, really contribute to her coming into her own and feeling like, maybe I don't need the patty cakes. And all of the things that Marge is insecure about, for example, like the fact that she has glasses, seem to be things that Rich loves and finds wonderful about her. She feels comfortable being herself around him instead of feeling this need to play a part in order to earn other people's love, because the love that he has for her is something that he offers freely. It's not something she has to fight for or prove herself worthy of. And because of the unconditional nature of that love, again, she stops feeling the need to win the patty cake's approval. And I think that she recognizes that there's a purity to Rich's friendship and his interest in her that really isn't present with the patty cakes. So, trying to integrate herself into their group, which would require her to deny that kinder, sweeter part of herself, and to kind of be a mean girl and betray her best friend Lily's trust, which we see earlier on in the show, and to abandon her whole true self in general, just really isn't worth it, because through Rich's example she learns that true friends don't make demands like that. They're just there for you, they accept you, they love you as you are. And it's not a particularly dramatic thing that Rich does here to help Marge course correct her life. It's just him being a kind person, it's him being a good friend, it's him being present with her, and this positive presence in her life at that. And as small as that may seem, to Marge, it means the world. So, yes, it matters. But obviously, the biggest thing that Rich does, as we know, if we've seen the show, is to sacrifice his life during the Black Spot fire to make sure that Marge survives. There is this ice box, I think, some kind of box, and there's only room for one person. And so he makes sure that Marge gets into the box, and then he closes it and then lies down on top of it so that she can't get out. And she survives. She doesn't fall prey to the fire or to any of the smoke inhalation because, he's sealed her in there. He's lying on top of the box. He's making sure that she is safe. And the reason that they end up at the club is when Ronnie goes there to meet her dad, who's in hiding from the police, and they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this is just genuinely tragic because they're both kids and they have to suffer as a result of this hatred and selfishness on the part of these men who start the fire and target Ronnie's dad and the Black and minority community of Derry in general. So for these innocent kids to be caught up in this just adds to this tragedy of this community being targeted unfairly by this mob of people who let their fear and their desire for power and control drive their actions no matter who they hurt. But despite the tragic context, Rich frames this sacrifice as a courageous act by a brave knight rescuing his fair maiden, which is a really adorable callback to a conversation that he and Marge have about knights and fair maidens earlier on in the show. And this scene where he puts Marge in the box and makes sure that she's safe and gives up his life for her is this incredibly emotional sequence, which I think everyone who watched the show was very deeply affected by it, at least from what I've seen. And not just because of the sacrifice itself, but because Rich is this 12-year-old boy who's making this huge selfless decision to sacrifice himself for the sake of someone that he loves, when many of the adults in this town, by contrast, are so consumed by their hatred and their selfish lust for control that, ironically, they don't measure up to the actions of this one little boy. You have fully grown men in this same sequence who are being put to shame by the courage of this kid who isn't even supposed to be there when this attack occurs. But I think the fact that Rich's decision is driven by love really highlights the importance of his character and what I think that he stands for. Because not only is he the antithesis to the hatred on display from the mob setting the fire, he's the embodiment of that quote from the Hobbit films, which Gandalf says, "I have found that it is the small everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love." And this obviously is Rich in a nutshell. Like I said earlier, it's not so much about the big, earth-shattering, world-changing things that you do. It's in the little things or the things you do within your own community that really matter. As we find out later, Rich saving Marge opens the door for Richie Tozier, if you remember that's Finn Wolfhard's character in the movies, whom we learn is her future son, to join his iteration of the Losers Club in defeating Pennywise for good in It Chapter 2. Now, Rich couldn't have foreseen any of that happening, but his sacrifice is part of what makes it possible for Marge to survive and to grow up and to eventually go on to raise one of the people who ends this fight permanently. And it's that idea of what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I think that's a quote from Hamilton, if I'm remembering correctly. But anyway, it's these seeds, these ripples that you sow by every little good act that you may not see as doing much or doing enough, but in the long run, they do matter and they do have purpose. And I think in the world that we live in now, that's plagued with so much social media guilt tripping, like you're not doing enough to support X cause or fix X problem if you're not posting about it a certain amount or trying to solve all the world's issues, and also this general sense of helplessness people feel in regards to fixing problems in the world, that a character like Rich is really important to see because I think he's a reminder to not get bogged down by that feeling that nothing you're doing is enough, or that you're a bad person because you're not doing enough, or that you just feel like you can't do anything to help people or make the world a better place because there's too many problems and there's too many things that are going wrong and it's just too overwhelming. But Rich's character sends this really strong message, in my opinion, that every little bit counts, even if it doesn't save the world, even if it doesn't fix every problem right away, even if it feels like everything that you're doing is not really making much of an impact, because maybe saving the whole world or doing something on a big grand scale is not any one person's job, because that's an impossible burden to bear in the first place. Maybe the only thing we can do and should do is to focus on what little things we can do in our own communities, or to borrow from Mr. Rogers, our neighborhoods, to help or to uplift people. And maybe even smaller than that. Maybe we only have the bandwidth to focus on helping and supporting our friends and loved ones, even if it's something as simple as bringing someone joy on a bad day. Rich, I think, stands for this idea that no act of love is wasted, no matter how big or how small, because every act of love, regardless of its size, so to speak, is still an infinitely more powerful force than the evils like hatred and prejudice and violence that permeate our world. It's not anyone's job to save the world, but perhaps it's just our job to be there for the people we've been entrusted to care for. So I'm going to leave you all with that food for thought for now. And I thank you for listening to me ramble on about Rich. Hopefully, it didn't require too many tissues. But anyway, before I end the episode for good, I wanted to close out with a book recommendation that's a little bit related to the themes in the story in It Welcome to Derry. If you like that whole kids on bikes dealing with supernatural phenomena genre. And so the book series actually that I wanted to recommend is the Small Spaces Quartet by Catherine Arden. And this is a middle grade series, so it's originally written for kids, but I really enjoyed it and I would highly recommend it. Again, if you like that whole It vibe or Stranger Things type of vibe. And I'm just going to read out the synopsis of the first book to give you an idea of what it's about. After suffering a tragic loss, 11-year-old Ollie, who only finds solace in books, discovers a chilling ghost story about a girl named Beth, the two brothers who loved her, and a peculiar deal made with the Smiling Man, a sinister specter who grants your most tightly held wish, but only for the ultimate price. Captivated by the tale, Ollie begins to wonder if the Smiling Man might be real when she stumbles upon the graves of the very people she's been reading about on a school trip to a nearby farm. Then, later, when her school bus breaks down on the ride home, the strange bus driver tells Ollie and her classmates, "Best get moving. At nightfall, they'll come for the rest of you." Nightfall is indeed fast descending when Ollie's previously broken digital wristwatch begins a startling countdown and delivers a terrifying message: run. Only Ollie and two of her classmates heed those warnings. As the trio head out into the woods, bordered by a field of scarecrows that seem to be watching them, the bus driver has just one final piece of advice for Ollie and her friends: avoid large places, keep to small. So again, this was originally written for kids, but it's a lot of fun. It's very spooky. It's got a very similar vibe to It and Stranger Things. and it's made up of 4 books, which the first one is Small Spaces, and then Dead Voices, followed by Dark Waters, and then the final book is called Empty Smiles. And it's got a lot of kids in a small town dealing with supernatural phenomena, this other dimension. I don't want to get too into it because it's spoiler territory, but I really enjoyed it. If this is something you're into, I'd highly recommend reading it. It's obviously a bit less crazy than something like it because it's for kids, but I think even adults can have a great time with it. So that's my book recommendation for this episode. I'm probably going to try to leave off every episode with some sort of a recommendation. It'll most likely be a book or series of books, but I may recommend some TV shows and movies or even games that may or may not be relevant to the topic of the episode preceding it. I'm going to try to keep it relevant, but if I just go veer off into left field, just bear with me. I read a lot, I watch a lot, and I like to recommend things that I love. So with that does bring us to the actual end of our episode. Again, thank you so much for being here and for listening. And if you're interested in following me or the podcast, I cross-post to a few different platforms. So if you follow my Instagram, which is at Elian with a pen, that's all one word, all lowercase. It's spelled ELIANN with a pen. I post every update there, from podcast episodes to posts on my blog or my Substack, and they're all under the same name, which is Elian with a pen. The podcast in particular, I host through Substack, but it's cross-posted to Spotify as well as YouTube Music, so you can look me up on any of those platforms. And if you're also interested in supporting my pursuits as a writer, my Substack, Elian with a pen, is the primary place where I post my writing. I've posted a few short works so far, and I'm currently in the process of writing and posting a multi-chapter serialized fantasy story that's sort of a grown-up Red Riding Hood retelling, somewhat loosely inspired by the beloved Cartoon Network series Over the Garden Wall. That's called Lost in the Woods, and the first couple of chapters are already up, so if that's something that piques your interest, it is a Substack exclusive, but subscriptions for now are free. If you'd like to monetarily support my endeavors, I've just set up a Buy Me a Coffee, which I'll post the link to, that's also under Elian with a pen. There's no obligation to donate, but if you feel compelled to help me out in building my platform and supporting my writing and this podcast, please feel free to pitch in. Any amount, no matter how small, is great. But again, it's not an obligation. But if you do donate, I'm very grateful in advance for your support. So that brings this first episode of Stories That Shaped Me to a close. Once again, for the third time, I thank you all for listening, and please feel free to share this with anyone else you think might enjoy it. Until next time, this is Elian J. Kildare, or EJ Kildare, signing off. See you in the next episode. The intro and outro music is Tropical Summer by Top Flow on Pixabay. The cover image for this podcast is taken from Carol Malmeda 03 on Pixabay and edited in Canva.